Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and we are here at KubeCon in Detroit. And today we have with us once again Nati Shalom, CTO at Cloudify. First of all, Nati, it's great to see you in person. We have been talking to each other for so long during this COVID phase, virtually on different calls. But seeing you in person is a totally different excitement, right?
Likewise, and I feel at home in many ways because we did spoke a lot on the topic, and it feels great to see people in person, like post-COVID, even though there's still masks here, which kind of remind us that COVID did exist. But yes, it does feel at home.
Which also brings me to the point of we are here at KubeCon in person. Tell us a bit about what has been your experience when you walk through the booth, hallway track, where you talk to a lot of folks who may be a potential customer or maybe an existing customer user. So talk a bit about your experience so far.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. I was actually talking to an event organizer just recently that on one hand, the talks keeps on talking again, almost the same thing, like as if nothing have changed or not something fundamental have changed. But at the same time, when you're talking to people at the corridor, they basically all admit that something fundamentally doesn't work. The developer experience is not good enough, or a lot of developers are feeling frustrated from the fact that it's still very complex to write application and get it into production. Platform engineers are frustrated because they have much more work than they're supposed to do, and the number of tools that they need to manage is growing unproportionally to deal with. And just looking at the booth here and the number of vendors even doing the same thing, it's just growing and growing, but still becoming very complex. So there is this undercurrent of frustration that exists here that is not actually in the front stage. And it started to bubble, mostly at offline discussions, less on the actual panels and discussion that you could see here in the keynotes. And that's something that I think will blow up at some point, and it's starting to blow up, in my view.
No, once again, very great observation. We are also hearing a lot about, once again, when it comes to complexity is becoming a pain point. We are not seeing that people are getting deterred and discouraged from using it, but it is becoming a concern. How are you seeing that? And then what kind of trends you are seeing where companies are trying to simplify things so folks can consume these technologies without getting overwhelmed with the complexity?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, and probably a billion-dollar question if we're talking about the entire market. I think the closest one to that is what happens with Spotify Backstage, which is kind of, I think, a project that is dealing in the CNCF ecosystem, dealing specifically with that problem. And it basically deals with how do you bring to the developers all the tools into one place, and which is one of the problems that developers are facing. The other thing that everyone is talking about is turning a lot of the infrastructure resources into self-service. And what we announced here is really how do we do that? How do we actually create, let's say, a Kubernetes cluster and the environments around Kubernetes cluster into a self-service environment, which is still a complex process. And the things that we announced here is a discovery mechanism. Discovery basically automates the process of creating Kubernetes cluster as a self-service environments for developers. So you could actually have a Kubernetes cluster for development, for production, but you don't have to create it yourself. And that's kind of where that plugs in. So in many ways, think about self-service as a mechanism to take away the human from the process of managing the environments. And that brings something that we'll probably talk about. It's the platform itself and what's the role of the DevOps versus what's the role of the developer itself in that new world.
Now, I want to talk about Cloudify itself. Talk a bit about what announcements you made here at KubeCon that aligns with our discussion to make things simpler to solve a lot of problems for the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Yeah, so I touched a little bit about the discovery, but let's talk about what is discovery all about. So we said, okay, if the environment is complex, the way to turn it into something simple is by turning it into self-service. What does self-service mean? It means that I can click a button and get the environment. If I'm a developer, I can click a button or call a single API and deploy things into the dev, and deploy things into production. So discovery automate that process. That's in a nutshell. It allows you to find out the clusters that are relevant to you, register it, put the right information for that, and then a developer can push code into those clusters very easily. That's what discovery means. Now, there is a lot of custom work that can be added to that afterwards, but the generic part really covers most of the Kubernetes cluster, the EKS, AKS, GKE, the Kubernetes, basically Google, Amazon, and Azure. And that's what discovery really means. It's automating the process of creating self-service Kubernetes environments, regardless of whether it's a vendor A or vendor B, regardless of whether it's running on a public cloud or a private cloud. And it also, in that way, provides that consistent layer across many clusters. So the other feature that we added to Cloudify in that case was also the ability to have a lot of self-service environments, out-of-the-box Kubernetes environments, Kubernetes with Istio, Spot Inst, and things of that line. One of the other things that we've announced is also the ability to deal with day 2 operation, drift management. So how do we detect drift? How do we actually push code while there is a drift? How do we automate the update process in those type of environments? And a bunch of other features that are supposed to help simplifying this ability to simplify the developer experience on Kubernetes clusters. There is a list behind it. I'm not going to go through the list of features, but those are the main highlights.
I want to change the topic from technology to a bit of cultural side. Sure. We talked about developers, then DevOps, DevSecOps, SREs, and now we are talking about DevOps is that we talked about platform engineering. But in a nutshell, the point is to have ownership from the very beginning to the very end. When I look at it from a different perspective, from a developer's perspective, it gives them a very good visibility into writing, deploying, and the end. So talk a bit about. Are we going through this transition of, look, it's very nice to create new labels every 6 months. But what is really important is that what are we trying to really do there? In some cases, something like assembly line for automobile, it does make sense, But sometimes you need just, ownership, like a chef, it just prepare the whole, it depends on how you look at things. So talk a bit about the core of the problem without us getting confused by all the labels.
So the core of the problem is that at the end of the day, it's the same problem that exists for years. I want to be able to get code into production as fast as possible with as little friction as possible. That's the core of the problem. Why is that not happening yet? We're supposed to be beyond that for a couple of years. The reason why it's, I think there are 2 reasons. One reason is the complexity of the infrastructure itself. Most of the DevOps automation was focused on automating the infrastructure itself, less on the developer experience. It's putting CI/CD in the pipeline, infrastructure as code, Kubernetes obviously, but in essence, it actually made the architecture of the application much more complex. Distributed infrastructure as code is a complex thing, and developer finding themselves dealing with 80% of their time, or even more, not doing development, but doing other things that are related to that infrastructure. And that's neither efficient nor the right things for those developers because they're not really skilled to that. And it creates other problem of consistency and other things that I think exist today. And that's kind of, I would say, raise the level of frustration on both, if you like, developers and DevOps. The second thing is that it gets worse with scale. So as companies start to scale, the number of DevOps that you have to support those environments versus the number of developers, the ratio get higher and higher, meaning that there's more developers on the same amount of people in DevOps. So obviously the level of service that developers get lower and lower when you scale. So that doesn't work as well. So I think that's the kind of, when I analyze it, those are the 2 main things that made that problem blow up in a sense.
Right. And now just go back to the technology side is that when we do say, hey, we start talking about platform engineers. The fact is that there is a huge gap in supply and demand of skilled people, right? And that is not going to, you're not going to be able to hire more people either way. So talk a bit about how, once again, technology is going to help folks, to kind of ease that pain, and what kind of movements you are seeing within the industry where folks are moving. Because we still talk a lot about companies that, DevOps, it sounds good on paper, but they still have silos.
Yep. So I think we talked about the supply and demand, right? And I would say in smaller scale, the way it worked is that developer asks for an environment and someone, human, which is called DevOps or platform engineer, was creating that environment by calling Amazon API or Azure API, whatever. Obviously, that doesn't scale because there's more developers, less DevOps. Platform is really a way, in a way, to take part of that DevOps work and make it self-service, make it generic, a product, instead of someone human writing code. So that really changes the relationship between what we expect from a DevOps and what we expect from a developer. We expect from a DevOps to build a platform, to manage a platform, not to manage the developer thing. And the platform would be something that automates how developers access environments, create environments without having any human in that process. So that, in that way, it can work in a way that scales much better because there is not human in the way. And developer gets what they want to without too many friction in that process. Getting that platform to work, that's a whole different story. And I think we're really in the inception of that concept and understanding what that platform means. How do you do it in the right way so that it wouldn't become the next DBA, if you like, of the cloud? And that's kind of, I think, where we are right now.
Nati, once again, thank you so much for sitting down with me. And as I said, it's a really great honor and pleasure to sit with you in person and do this interview. I wish we can do more of these, but the reality is that we will have to go back to the online recordings and interviews. But I really appreciate this discussion. And as usual, I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.